Mr. Pearce, can I just ask whether you recognise these figures? During 2022, there were 10,454 offences of modern slavery recorded by the police in England and Wales, less Devon and Cornwall for some reason. I don't know why Devon and Cornwall are not part of these figures. And of those, 95 cases are currently recorded as having resulted in a charge or a summons. So what that is telling me is that 2% of the total cases under investigation by the police in 2022 for these matters resulted in a charge. Is that correct?
So I agree with the second half of the statement. I don't necessarily have the same data that you have in front of you, depending on the time periods. However, the charge rate as it stands at this moment in time is at 2.3%.
Yeah.
So that's from a quarter 4, 22 to 23 of 2698 crimes. So that's the last quarter.
This committee, Mr. Pearce, I'm asking this as a police officer in general as well. We investigate all manner. We in terms of our reports and in terms of the work that we do, we look at all types of criminal offending. And one thing that comes back time and time again is the charge-out rates for offences are unbelievably low. I mean, it's extraordinary that we have a circumstance here where we're talking about this, but this is more than for rape. It's in terms of charge-out rates. To me, there is something fundamentally wrong with how the police are investigating matters, that we continuously have these figures put in front of us, which are just not acceptable. I don't think they're acceptable to the public. So what is it that the police are not doing that they should be doing to remedy this situation?
So thank you. It's a really valid and challenging question, and I would agree with you that 2.3% for modern slavery charges is low and should be increased. And we are, as a programme, as a national programme, showing police forces what good practice looks like in order to increase that. So I touched on the rest of my answer earlier on, in that whilst we've got perpetrators that commit modern slavery offences and they are caught within that 2.3% charge, they are also, and it's unusual for this offence actually, they are also prosecuted for other issues. So, controlling prostitution, for the whole movement of drugs. All of those other serious offences, I've mentioned earlier on about polycriminality, we will charge them for those aspects as well. Now, granted, you could say, well, why don't you just charge for the modern slavery as well? So,
I understand the point you're making, and it's a valid point. But the problem again comes, so we go on from this, and this is again where the police fall down throughout the criminal justice system. And it's astonishing, some of the figures. The lack of referrals to the Crown Prosecution Service of criminal allegations is absolutely extraordinary. Now, somebody within the police is directing or giving autonomy to police officers to essentially ignore a whole raft of criminal allegations. That has to be the case, because if police officers were being told to take these allegations seriously, we wouldn't have this situation.
Yeah, I don't think I can agree with that. So I don't think any crime report that comes into the policing, whether this be about modern slavery or otherwise, gets ignored. And I get the statement and I understand why it's been made. But specifically around modern slavery, I can't underestimate the complexity of these crimes. Now, you asked about how can we improve those results. So what we do know is that where you've got specialist teams who are focused around exploitation, you get better results. We know that. We also know that if we engage with victims using third-party resource, so there's a Victim Navigator project, which I hope you've heard about. If not, we can share evidence of that after, who effectively work within law enforcement, but they are third-party, and they engage really well. Victim liaison officers, who are police officers, we've trained 288 of those in the last couple of years, who are specialist people that understand how to get best evidence and look after victims. We also produce numerous guidance, training packages, and we debrief any large investigation and share that best practice as well. But there is an element here which you are touching on really in terms of police and competing demands, which is that if you've got a police force that has modern slavery and wider exploitation within their force control strategy, you will see better and more focused results. And in order to do that, I would.
So basic competence is what you're talking about. I mean,
Basic governance.
Well, basic governance. But we get this time and time again on this committee where you just made the statement that if a force prioritises or has a unit, or however you want to describe it, of people who are whose job it is to prosecute these matters, then you get better results. Now, how is that not standard practice across every police force in the country? It has to be incompetence, because as Mr. Harrison said, Parliament has directed that these matters are required by the police to be investigated in a proper way. And so who is being held accountable for these errors?
So it's not incompetence, it's about competing demands. And Parliament, as you quite rightly said, have directed it. Modern Slavery Act was excellent in doing that, as was the strategy that dropped out of it. We don't have a national strategy at this moment in time. The strategy and the bill would recommend that police forces have specialist exploitation teams. If you've got competing demands and you've got a direction that comes in that shape or form, then that is going to focus minds in terms of police forces.
One of the things that certainly police officers speak to me, mainly off the record because they don't want to be quoted in respect of this, is the tensions in the relationship between the police and the Crown Prosecution Service, and the level of evidence that is required for the Crown Prosecution Service to even consider charging a matter. And the police, certainly the ones I've spoken to, and this is not universal, take the view that, so essentially what you've just said, if a police officer is faced with a situation where they don't have that killer piece of evidence, but they have evidence to suggest an offence has taken place, they know it's a waste of time sending it to the Crown Prosecution Service, because the Crown Prosecution Service will say, unless the evidence is absolutely a slam dunk, we're not going to, we're not even interested in prosecuting this. So is there a certain amount of fatigue within the police force in terms of saying we're not even going to bother sending these to the CPS because we know what the answer is going to be back in terms of prosecuting this?
Well, I'm sure you're going to find examples of that. I'll also be able to share examples of where that hasn't happened, and we've gone to the nth degree in order to make sure that we get modern slavery prosecutions. And I've given you a live case of that at the moment. I'll perhaps bring Lynette in a second. I think your point around whether this is about evidence, prosecution or otherwise, there's a victim at the heart of this. And we would always make sure that those victims are protected and cared for, whether that through the NRM system and that system that's existing.
Do you feel that police officers have got into a mindset, because of the general relationship between the police and the Crown Prosecution Service, when there is some evidence, should we say, or a certain amount of evidence to suggest an offence has taken place, that we're not going to even be bothered sending it to the CPS, not because as police officers we don't want to prosecute it, we know we're wasting our time?
Well, like I said, I'm sure there will be examples of that. There will be many examples, and my colleague is going to speak to you about one in the next session about where that doesn't happen. So competing demands is relevant, and I think what you're articulating is definitely a situation that was occurring around 2015-16. I go back to the impetus that the Modern Slavery Act and the strategy at that time gave police forces. Another aspect in order to hold police forces account, if not through their own force control strategy, is to engage with PCCs. If this is important to the community, it will be important to a PCC. If it's important to a PCC, it will be in their police and crime plan, of which then police forces will respond.
Okay, and just to confirm, before I think it's only fair to give Lynette a chance to answer the points I put, is that we talked in the figures about the charge-out rate being 2%. What's the referral rate? So how many of the 10,000, the figure that I quoted, the 10,000 figure, that matters under investigation, how many of those are actually referred to the Crown Prosecution Service by the police?
Have you got that answer, Lynette?
I've got the numbers of referrals for the last 5 years. Yeah. I don't have the percentage. Would you like me to share the numbers with you?
Yes, please.
So in 2022, there were 286 referrals for modern slavery. 2021, there were 329. 2020, there were 331. We can share this data set with you.
286 referrals out of 10,000 cases in 2022, and of those, 95 have resulted in a charge. So essentially, if I'm misunderstanding what's just been said, essentially 50% of the cases that are give or take that were referred in 2022 resulted in a charge or a summons.
It's 68.8% in 2022 was the cases referred to the CPS that resulted in modern slavery charges.
I think in respect of that, the figures 68%. I mean, it sort of hides behind the fact of the lack of referrals, isn't it? We're talking about a very small number of cases here. That's the point. And I just wonder, you're the lead for the CPS in respect of it. Have you ever asked Mr. Pearce or any other senior police officer, why are you not sending us more cases?
Yes, and I think Jim and I certainly have had lots of conversations about that. And the other thing that I think is also important is our regional relationships. So in the CPS, there's a modern slavery lead in each area and division who liaises closely with their policing counterpart. And that is very much, I would say, at the centre of those conversations, which is looking across the different types of sectors and different exploitation types. So looking at the makeup of cases that are coming into the CPS, are there opportunities or missed opportunities for investigations, and how can the prosecutor support that? So I know you asked a question earlier about police fatigue. I think that doesn't apply so much in modern slavery cases. These are cases that are dealt with generally on our complex casework units or our specialist divisions, and there is very close working between individual investigators and individual prosecutors, often before any arrest is made.
Sorry, just to add to that, and sorry to jump in, but I don't want to give the impression from this committee that out of you mentioned 10,000, we might just have a look at that, but a number of crimes, many of those are still continuing, so many of those will be presented to the prosecution.
Mr. Pearce, the situation is actually worse than that, because the brief that I've got is actually saying there are 16,000 referrals to the NRM in that year. So of the 16,000, 10,000 are being investigated by the police, and 95 are resulting in a charge. I mean, what's the conviction rate? I agree with you that the charge rate needs to increase, and we're working hard to do that. That's a point that we will agree on. But I will just make that point around the NRM is not a crime recording system. So those are 17,000 referrals with victims that have reported the fact that they are victims, obviously, people that reported the fact that they're victims. They will work their way through the system. 40% of those sit outside of the UK. And there will be a number of others that will manifest themselves as a crime, but actually the way that they're recorded and so forth gives a police force no chance to investigate, just because of the details within. Mr. Jones, give us the secret as to tell us, outside of both the police and the Crown Prosecution Service, because we want to hear this. What is it that is going to, the next time that you all appear in front of this committee, what is it that is going to be done in the next 12 months that is going to ensure that referral rate and conviction rate and charge rate is going up? What is it that's going to happen?
So the criminal justice system that we operate in, you cannot look at one offence in isolation. There are a range of factors which impact on this offence and other offences, which include digital evidence, disclosure, demands from crimes in action and other offences in a police force, and indeed for the NCA. So there is something around prioritisation of this as a threat. There is something about the prioritisation of victim-centred crime, which is very, very resource intensive. Drug trafficking is relatively easy to prosecute compared to modern slavery or child abuse or any other sexual offence. And mastering digital technology so that law enforcement is not constantly on the back foot with more and more data trying to deal with disclosure obligations under CPIA, and is able to investigate very quickly and put a full file submission if it's appropriate, or get a threshold test from the CPS, is something that we're all trying to work on.
So if I may interject, sorry,
sure.
through you, Chair, but that's not really answering his question. So we need to understand what really needs to happen from, the reason why it might have been a flippant comparison I made between drugs and sex, but it is much easier to go after drugs than it is all of the criminality around sex. What needs to happen for us to make it easier to go after the sex element of crime?
Continued investment in victims and survivors and victim navigators, and the ability to deal with people that are involved in this and have
Isn't
become
that
victims.
downstream?
That's one of the things. There are a range of other things upstream in relation to this. When people present, you need a credible, well-resourced investigation. And that means that the investment in digital technology and the ability to turn an account, which will always be challenged, to turn an account into good evidence and achieve best evidence.
Rather than the nature of the crime.
Okay.
So it is the nature of the crime because you have a victim. You haven't got a bag of drugs and a perpetrator. You have got a victim, and that victim will be attacked and their account will be challenged. And you need to underpin that with corroborative evidence.
Okay, I'm just going to come back to James
Very
Daly.
briefly, Mr. Joseph. That's what you just. I understand why you've said what you've just said, but what you've just said is incredibly worrying because what you effectively said in the last sentence you said is turning an account into good evidence. You know, any statement. I was a criminal lawyer for many years. Any statement made in any police station in this country for any offence is going to get challenged. It's not for you to turn it into good evidence. It's for a jury to consider whether it's good evidence or not. If somebody's brave enough to give evidence, that should be the evidence on the face of it. You don't need to alter that or speak about that. We should be believing witnesses and we should be relying on their testimony.
We do, but we also need to support them and corroborate them with good digital evidence and other evidence so that those individuals will succeed in giving that evidence.
Well, Stuart, I think you've already answered the question I'm about to ask you, but I'm going to put it this way, in that what concerns me, and it's not just in this area, I think you were in for the previous line of questioning, is I think there are barriers put in the way. Referral comes to you as the investigating officer. I think there are barriers within both the police force and the CPS. This is a complex area. I accept everything you said, so there are different nuances, every case is different. But I actually think the system makes it more difficult for you as the investigating officer to bring a charge to be tested before a jury. Is that an unfair statement for me to make?
Me personally, yes. And I only say that because I've been doing this for 7-8 years now in this particular role. I have a fantastic relationship with CPS. Maybe it's slightly easier for me because I have assigned lawyers, so I will often go to a lawyer. And I think what point you made earlier around the police and the CPS, I sometimes think it comes from a police confidence issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of, if I make an arrest for any offence, I am immediately thinking, I've got 24 to 36 hours to prove that offence, and I'm taking it to CPS. I think that with every single person I arrest, because that, in essence, is why you're arresting them. Now, there is a confidence and a way to present a threshold test case, as there is full code. And I think, as you rightly put, there are less and less cases going to the CPS, which then results in less and less confidence with those who are presenting them to do it.
Stuart, can I ask, is it correct, and I'm reading out a statement in quotations here, so it may not be correct, that Lancashire Police has the best charge rate for human trafficking offences out of any force in the country at almost 30%?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's... I have to say,
I don't know what year that quote was. So,
if that is accurate to you, I have to say I've been sat on these committees for 4 years in both the Justice and Home Affairs Committee, and in half an hour you're the most convincing police witness I have heard in terms of actually doing the job that you are paid to do. On the basis that is correct, and the charge out rate nationally, I think we heard is 2.whatever% it is. Very difficult question for you because I'm sure you're not going around to the police forces and seeing what's going on. But what is it that you're doing right and they're doing wrong?
I think that statistic will have been a few years ago, I think, when we were purely focused on sex trafficking.
Yeah.
There was a problem in East Lancashire around, I think we maybe saw it coming over the hill, maybe before others around. There's a clear sex trafficking problem here. So I think because when we go into an address, whether it's any kind of form of brothel visit or we instruct a car to be stopped that we think is involved in sex trafficking, I 100% guarantee you I will arrest any male that is close to it. Because for me, in terms of what the law allows, there is no reason for them to be in a brothel. There's no reason to be them taking women to outcalls, whatever it may be. And then it's the point of dealing it. Now, a lot of the time, like I said, 90% of the time, if we go back to then, 90% of the women we engaged with said, no, there's nothing going on here, nothing at all. My view was, yes, there is, but I will prove it without you. So pretty much everything we did at that time, and still do, we did a large Chinese sex trafficking case in September. No complainant. But it's true. It's true. We won't get the convictions without it. And what we do then use is we obviously use everything that's open to us to prove that case, whether it be the key bits, mobile phones, adult websites. We can often, you will find, we've had 2 cases where we've actually found the diary of the victim. And while she might look me in the eyes and say, well, no, there's nothing going on here. This is all my own, I'm doing it of my own choice, or there's nothing happening. But then the diary will tell the truth, which is, as discussed before around, I know you've met victims of it, it's not something you ever want to read. But I would suggest that is why our percentage is so much higher, because we take that stance that, right, we'll prove it complaintless.
Well, after that, there's not really much else to say, in the sense, in that what I always try to do in these I was a criminal lawyer for the best part of 20 years, and I come from an era before matters were sent to the CPS for charging. I come from an era where policing essentially is what you've just said, which I just don't think is there now. I don't know whether it's training. I don't know what the issue is. But you have described in a minute what a police officer should do, and that's the reason why you're having success. So I'll just say very well done.
Thank you.
I mean, one of the things I'm going about on here is the implementation of the charging standard, and how that is interpreted by different lawyers. I see that as a real problem within the criminal justice system. I see the bar to prosecution in terms of the evidential requirements that the CPS want the police to meet as being far too high. Does that, in terms of your experience in these types of cases, is that a fair criticism?
I think it's a fair criticism in some areas.
Yeah.
The difficulty is, as you'll well appreciate from your time in practice, that each case is identified on its own factual matrix.
Yeah.
If I told you that Operation Ford, the first time I was brought in, they had been told by a lawyer that I didn't deal with that case could not be prosecuted. Yeah. And so, while I humbly disagree with my colleague from the police, my experience is there is not enough education, there is not enough engagement, and there's not enough resource. And education means understanding the terminology we're using and applying it. Engagement is proactively looking. I would be fascinated to know the distinction between proactive responses and reactive responses. I suspect Lancashire Police are reacting to some, but more importantly, proactively searching it out to deal with it. I would like to see financial investigation officers who are, forgive me, as scarce as hen's teeth, but they are vital in analysing and interpreting and providing. And something else I would really commend upon you, please, can we get the left hand and the right hand talking to each other? I'm trying to prosecute last year a gentleman by the name of David Handy for cheating the public purse because he failed to declare his illegal income of £250,000 to His Majesty's Revenue and Customs. It took me 3 years to get a statement from HMRC. We can't have this siloing of stakeholders. We all want to achieve the same thing. We may all be on different paths getting there, but if we are not talking and we are not sharing, and forgive me, but the use of language like it's a DPA issue or it's a data issue. I'm sorry, I'm signed up to the CPIA. I'm quite clear about what data I can use and when, but telling me that I can't have the name of my victim and her date of birth or his date of birth and their bank account details in order to prosecute my case is frankly ludicrous. So we need to stop that. And I don't just say that to His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, I mean social services. In Operation Field, they were in the process of deporting one of my 15-year-old victims back to Vietnam during the case. I should add, and this is a salutary message that we in this area need to understand that same victim is now in a relationship with the perpetrator and has 2 children with him. So victims are not straightforward in modern slavery cases, and that is what makes them challenging. And that is why I admire enormously those who, like I do, where necessary, pursue in the absence of complainant evidence. Because actually, it will always be challenged.
I'm sorry, just one final point.
Yeah.
One of the things I really do despair at within the criminal justice system, and I may be an outlier in respect of this, is the downgrading of individual testimony. And I think it's Mr. Jones from the NCA sort of touched on that a little bit in respect of that. And I think we're getting to a point in the criminal justice system where essentially somebody's gone through an absolutely appalling set of circumstances where there may well not be another witness who can support that. But for some reason, we seem to be at the starting point, well, that witness testimony is not enough. It's not enough to test that in a court situation. And if I'd been the victim of modern, of trafficking or sexual exploitation, and there was no other witness to it, and I was brave enough to make a statement, and then the police were saying, well, that's not really enough, we need to go and do this, that, and the other. I find that appalling.
If I may I answer that? I agree on the face of it. But going back, and may I make this very clear, I am never critical of my complainants in modern slavery cases. I've lost one in 12 years, okay, where I did have a lying victim.
I'm sort of talking about prior to the case coming to
you
mainly.
Absolutely.
So with the police,
But when we get a complainant statement, if it's given at first instance, often that recollection is trauma recollection. And when it gets to me, for example, or a charging lawyer in the CPS to make the decision, we are looking at it against a background of evidence that may directly contradict that. Okay? And that's not that we are looking to disbelieve the victim, but I think sometimes, and perhaps my colleague can help.
I'm sorry, Dan. You're trying the case, in effect. I understand the point you're making, but that's not... obviously, there's matters of the public purse, there's matters of the public interest, but it's not your job, I would humbly suggest, to be deciding whether a jury is going to believe, whether this is going to be believed because there may be that contradiction or this contradiction. In the justice system that we have, if there is a case to answer, it should be put in front of a court, not discussed between the police and the CPS prior to getting there. And this attitude to the criminal justice system permeates the police because they don't send cases because they know that the cases don't get taken apart before, if they send it to the CPS.
The problem we've got is that in order for a case to be charged, the Crown Prosecution Service have an evidential threshold, and if that evidential threshold is met, then there has to be a public interest. The difficulty we've got is, and why I am often brought in unusually early on in investigations, for example, like Operation Fort, is I will often have a first statement, look at it and go, I can see issues with this, but perhaps we can do a further interview. Can we use this method of trying to obtain the account? So, for example, there's a study being done with Northamptonshire Police and a gentleman by the name of Dr. Craig Barlow, informing Northamptonshire Police how can they better obtain statements from victims. And that is a really good starting point. But what we're trying to do is not traumatise them again, but use the best techniques possible. It was a recommendation I made in the review back in 2016. How do we get their account?